Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I have the pleasure of welcoming Dennis MacDonald back to the channel. Dennis, today we're going to read something from your book, Mythologizing Jesus, regarding chapter 23, The Living Dead. Before we actually read the comparison, could you give us an intro into what this chapter is about?
Many of your viewers will be familiar with the famous story of Jesus after his death appearing to two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. And there's been a huge discussion in the literature about the origins of this story and so on. But the parallels with Odysseus returning at last to his own home after slaying the suitors and revealing himself to Laertes is really quite amazing. These parallels are extremely important. And so I think we'll just read them. You okay? And so we'll just read the parallels back and forth. And if your viewers would like to check up on us, they could look at Luke 24:13 and following and follow along. So I'll read the left-hand column from the Odyssey, and you can read from the right-hand column.
Sure.
Odysseus, thought dead, returned alive.
Jesus died, but returned alive.
Odysseus went to his father's farm.
Jesus met the disciples on the road.
Outside the city to see if he would recognize him with his eyes.
Outside Jerusalem, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him.
And I'm not going to read the Greek, but as you can see on the page, the Greek wording is almost identical for the eyes and recognition. Laertes was sad as he worked his garden.
The disciples were sad as they walked.
The stranger, that is Odysseus, began asking questions.
The sojourner began asking questions.
And so far, Laertes does not recognize his son has returned because his eyes are kept from recognizing him. And the same thing is happening with Jesus. The disciples cannot understand who Jesus is. Laertes, the father, expressed his sadness over the death of his son and the violence of the suitors.
Cleopas expressed sadness over Jesus' death and the violence of the Jewish authorities.
Odysseus spoke with his father about himself in the third person, but the old man still did not recognize him.
Jesus spoke with his disciples about himself in the third person, but they still did not recognize him.
Odysseus revealed himself by means of his scar and knowledge of the trees that they planted when he was young, and there was a meal at another venue.
Jesus revealed himself by breaking and distributing bread at a meal at another venue.
Odysseus had told Laertes to look at the scar on his leg for proof. I here am that man, Alphtaus ego.
Jesus told the disciples to look at the wounds on his hands and feet. It is I, myself.
Ego me Alphtos. Those who recognized Odysseus were astonished, and he comforted them.
On recognizing Jesus, the disciples were terrified, and he comforted them.
Let me continue reading. If Luke's readers picked up the clues and compared the last chapter of the gospel with the last book of the epic, they should have seen significance to the story invisible on the surface. Odysseus visited Hades without dying. Jesus died and returned from the dead. Odysseus' wound came from a hunting accident. Jesus's came from his execution. The recognition of Odysseus by Laertes demonstrated that the hero had returned home, but the recognition of the Jesus by his disciples demonstrated his status as the Messiah who conquered death. Here again, Luke does not merely imitate Homer, he rivals him by exalting Jesus over Odysseus. I think those parallels ought to be preachable.
Yeah, it's just a list of many that you found that are very clear to see the comparison. But I think what makes it even more profound is the order of the story in the Odyssey and the order of the story in the Gospel. They are the same in the same order.
Exactly. And in fact, mimesis criticism has 7 criteria to determine whether similarities between two texts can be attributed to direct literary imitation or simply to common themes and so on. The first 2 have to do with the status of the target. Was the proposed model available widely? That's the first criterion. And the second one, did other people imitate it? And of course, the Homeric epics were the most available texts in antiquity, and students learned how to imitate them in prose in order to do their own compositions. The next 3 criteria, esoteric, have to do with the strength of the parallels between 2 works. One of them is density. That's criterion 3. Are there lots of parallels or just a few? The second is the sequence or the order of them. That's criterion 4. This is the one you mentioned. And in this case, the parallels are not only dense, but they're sequential. The fourth one is, the fifth criterion is distinctive traits. Are there things in these 2 stories that bind them together to make, to actually flag the relationship? And I think they are. I think one would be that the eyes cannot recognize the stranger in front of them in both cases, and that the revelation of the hero's identity has to do either with a scar or with wounds. Those are distinctive traits, and they bind the 2 stories together in a hermeneutical dance. The next criterion is 6, that is interpretability. Does one learn something from the imitation by comparing it with its antecedent to make it understandable why an author would rewrite the story? And in this case, I think you have a theological reason to say that the Jesus story is more compelling than the one in Homer. And the final one is the one that's most difficult to establish, but it's called, number 7, it's called ancient recognitions. Did people in antiquity recognize these similarities between this story and the gospel story and the Homeric one? And we do have examples of that in Byzantium with the so-called Homerocentones. These are Christian poems retelling gospel stories that use Homeric lines. And when they retell the story, let's say, of doubting Thomas, recognizing Jesus's wounds in the Gospel of John and so on, they use lines from the Odyssey, chapter 20, book 24, in order to talk about the recognition of the wound and Jesus's declaration, "It is I." So yes, we have in this case all 7 criteria that are satisfied. Now, I can tell you that these criteria cut both directions. In many cases, I've suspected that there was a relationship between the biblical texts and Homer that didn't satisfy these criteria, and I just chucked them. They just didn't have enough strength to bind them together. So for for the criteria to work, they have to be work in eliminating possibilities as well as establishing possibilities. The same way that you'd have it in a scientific lab, where if you have criteria and testing, the testing is only going to work if you have negative results as well as positive results, potentially.
Dr. MacDonald, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. This has been a pleasure.